Welcome! Thank you for watching the recording of the Zoom event, Africans on Race in America, hosted by Journeys International on June 10th, 2020. I'm Robin Weber Pollock, owner and chief adventure officer of Journeys. Journeys International is an adventure design company that has created trips around the world since 1978. We believe that adventure is any experience that takes you outside your comfort zone to deepen discovery and possibly create a transformation. Recently, we've started expanding beyond travel to create a broader range of experiences that count as adventures by that definition. Travel can be an adventure, of course. So can a workshop. So can a day in your neighborhood, or, hey, so can a Zoom dialogue. So this event today is one of our new adventures, to step outside our usual, comfortable ways of thinking and discover new perspectives. We grappled among our team with the events and dialogue in the US about race relations leading up to this event, and we aimed to bring together the ingredients for a meaningful conversation that added some new perspectives while embracing the spirit and tradition of our company. Curiosity, reflection, human connection, and believing the best intentions in others are all values of Journeys. If you are here today, I hope you share the belief that we can learn from each other even if, especially if, we have had different life experiences and see the world differently. For 42 years, Journeys has been all about learning from diverse perspectives, and this conversation on this video is a continuation of the practice. Usually at Journeys, we try to keep conversations very fluid and participatory. But when rehearsing for this video, we realized that our speakers in Uganda, Kenya, and Senegal didn't all have reliable, crystal clear sound connections. So during the event, we asked live listeners, and I ask you now, to be flexible and to listen effortfully. We also asked live participants to submit all comments and questions in writing, and you will hear some of these in the Q&A portion toward the end of the video. We're about to join the recording and hear from our three speakers. We welcomed April N. Baskin, a diversity, equity, and inclusion coach from Senegal, James Macau Nzioka, a safari guide and entrepreneur from Kenya, and Paul Tumwenya, a naturalist and business owner from Uganda. And we're going to start with Paul. Paul Tumwenya is a trained ornithologist, a cultural guide, and a driver, and he is chairman of the Uganda Cultural Guides Club. He's a recipient of the 2017 Uganda Tourism Excellence Award for Best Cultural Guide and a guide trainer. Paul is also a leading conservationist in Uganda and the founder of Birds of a Feather, an NGO that funds general education as well as conservation training for orphans to incubate future careers in ecotourism. At home in Uganda, Paul lives with his wife and 4 bright-eyed children, and Paul has traveled to the US several times over the past 7 years, visiting the South, the Midwest, and the East Coast. So Paul, we're all curious to hear, what do you want to share with us about your perspectives on what race dynamics are like in the US, especially compared to your experiences at home?
Thank you, Robin. I welcome everyone. It's a pleasure having you here. It's more like I'm guiding. It's after the COVID incident happened, I've not been guiding now. I've been locked up and not playing the game that I do every day. It's funny. I have been to the US 3 times and traversed. Of course, the homeland is Michigan, but I go to different states. The first time I came, I think I was in Michigan, then I to New York and flew back. The second time I came, I was in Michigan, went to Ohio, flew to Albany, New York again, and then back. And then the third time I came, I was in Michigan and went to Philadelphia, where there was a birding expo, the American Birding Expo. Unfortunately, Bill Thompson passed on last year. We couldn't have the expo. I would have come back last year, but I couldn't make that. What I will say is, as an African, I have not had any problem of racism. The second time when I came, that's 2016, when I was working in New York, I was mesmerized when someone on the street was asking me for money, when someone on the street was asking me for direction. Unfortunately, I gave him direction to where I didn't know I was going. So he asked me, like, where is this place and this? I was working with the Patricia Wiswell and David. They are former clients of Janice. Unfortunately, they might not be here, but we were working together. He was behind them. Someone called me, like, I'm going to this place. Could you help me? Then I was like, just stand by the corner and you'll be right at the place. I didn't know the place. When I tell that to Africa or to Africans, they are like, oh my God, you mean even there are people who can ask you for direction? I have not felt any racial discrimination the time I have been there. And I always say, in Africa and where we are, we don't have a lot of media. We don't have many TVs. We don't have lots of concerns that people have to follow, that the Blacks are segregated, the Blacks are being killed and all that. I'll give an example of the recent of Floyd. It's only the urban people who could be knowing this. They feel bad. They are like, racism is bad. Let it be white, let it be black. Death is not good. But that is a population of 15%, the case of Uganda, where you'll find that people feel there is racism. We have had a challenge right from time immemorial. Within Africa, we had this World War I, the white man's superiority, whereby the black man inbuilt a fear that the white man was a small god. Anybody white was superior to Africa. Until the Common Man's Charter, after the fail of the League of Nations, amalgamating into the UN, United Nations Organization. That's when the Common Man's Charter was formed, and the Africans had to fight for themselves. That's when colonialism had to be put aside, and they are like, we cannot be colonized. We are a human race. But even then, we have a colonial legacy that has made the African inferior to the extent that we might not much feel what racism is. Why do I say that? Time might cut me short, but in Africa, in Uganda, we still study European history as a compulsory subject at advanced level. But African nationalism is still optional. That is a question for debate. So there's a colonial legacy which remained here that we as Africans we have to follow and do certain things in the perspective of the white race. So there is no much racism that is felt by the African because of that colonial legacy, because of what happened before. And up to today, that's why when we move around, if I drive you in my cars, when they see you, the young kids will wave you at you, Muzungu, Muzungu. They know everything comes from Muzungu. When Muzungu is there, they know everything is fine. So we don't have a very big problem with the racism, with the Black Americans, with what is happening. The video that went around of Floyd has caused a lot of questions without answers. There are more questions than answers. How can that happen? We expected these people to be more developed. We expected this not to happen within such a country. So people are having questions without answers. But this is from time immemorial. I'm talking of time from 1918, when World War I started, and World War II. And then Africans starting to get independence. That's when they started fighting the supremacy of the white man. That's when independence started coming in Uganda. But that was after World War II and signing the Common Man's Charter, that we realized that we are all human beings. And we have Africans like Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Haile Selassie, Julius Nyerere, who put the Africans at the forefront, and they're like, we have to fight for our rights. But it's something that happened in colonialism. But even up to today, it's hard to mention, quite rough. President Trump once mentioned that Africa needs recolonization. It was rude, but if you took that statement right, probably it could be, because we are not ready. There's no, the democratic procedures are not right. If you look at, I look at tourism in the case of Uganda, which is guided by politics, not by technocrats. What is this? You have people who can deliver, but they can't be in positions of delivering. That leaves lots of questions unanswered. And over time, probably we will get there. For now, that is my submission about this. I will welcome the questions, and I want to listen to my other counterparts, what they think about this.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Paul. We appreciate you sharing those reflections and that context that I think is probably new information for a lot of us. Our next speaker is James Makau Nzioka. Makau has been part of the Journeys family for 20 years. He's a devoted educator, naturalist, and self-made philanthropist. Makau is deeply thoughtful and really well acquainted with contemporary social and political issues, yet maintains his eternal optimism. Makau has helped to develop programs encouraging local youth in Kenya to become guides and protectors of the nation's wildlife, and he assists a self-help water project to alleviate problems associated with irrigation and water fetching in his village, as well as supporting women's groups that grow and sell vegetables, supporting public health education organizations and orphan education organizations, as well as initiating 2 projects to provide a well and a school library to his home village. Makau really orients his life toward channeling his passion for the well-being of his country and village into productive action. As a safari guide, Makau encourages visitors to consider his village's place in Kenya, Kenya's place in Africa, and Africa's place in the world. Makau has traveled extensively in the United States, visiting friends from coast to coast. Makau, thank you for being here to share your perspectives with us.
Thank you, Robin, for arranging the webinar. I'm excited to be part of this discussion. And personally for me, I think I've learned a lot in the not so many years I've been guiding. And I think the first thing I'll do is try and put into perspective the whole issue of race and between Africa and the rest of the world. Before colonization, there was Africa as a land used to have kingdoms. There were no countries until the invasion, or rather the scramble for Africa, which was, I think it was done in France, that European countries came in and started dividing and partitioning the continent into regions. And by so doing, they took over some areas. And it's mainly the British, the French, a bit of German, and the Portuguese. So before that, every single tribe used to have their own chiefs or own leaders. And that's why after the partitioning of Africa, it became apparent that we were learning new things. And when we look back at history, we tend to ask ourselves, why are there problems in terms of harmony among the African countries? And the issue that we tend to look away from is the fact that whenever countries were being formed, tribes were being put together. And by being put together, they were, quote unquote, given a leader. And when you have all that situation whereby a tribe was given a leader from another tribe, they felt like they were being looked at inferior. And that's actually, for me, I think that's why all these issues of race came into Africa. Now, skipping to the American and African version of colonialism, growing up in Kenya, which was a British colony, most of our education was based on the British system. And I tend to hear people saying that we speak the Queen's English. Initially, after independence, we had most of our programs were from Britain, but then came the US, and we started seeing all these soap operas and documentaries. And from our education system, we learned things that were directly and indirectly were part of our society or part of life. Like I remember we call it classes as opposed to the US where they call them grades. So in my class 5, which I think is a year 5 in the US, we learned about Tennessee River Development Authority, things that I can bet very few people, not only in Africa, but even in the US, know about, unless you're maybe from Tennessee. So from that, we got to learn a lot of stuff from Africa about the US. Now, the first time I came to the US, this is a link that I have to bring in when talks of culture. So when the first time I came to the US, I think was in 1992. And the first thing that was in my mind is I'm going to a country based on what I learned in either through education or my TV shows. So I learned about the Tennessee, as I said. I also learned about like growing up. Our TV show that we grew up was Little Kids on the Prairie. We grew up with John Wayne. So my mind was all about John Wayne, Wild West. I grew up with a farm, and also the other part that actually really hit me hard culturally was more of what you call teenagers, like the Beverly Hills. So culturally, my mind was also confused as to exactly what I'm going to get. But I've always believed in having an open mind when I go out. So when I got to the US, the first thing I noticed was life was way too fast for me. And I had to slow down. And because I couldn't slow down the way we do up home, I had to kind of catch up. So every single day, I was halfway what everybody else could do. And from that, I realized that unless I accept the fact that I'm in a different environment, I won't learn much out of where I am. So race came to the picture. And the first thing I noticed was having grown up in what's called middle class in the country. Middle class for us is let me take it back a bit. In the country, there are about maybe 8 different levels of classes. Mine was on the 5th level, which is pretty high for most of the locals in the country. So growing up, we rarely saw horses in our neighborhood. We rarely saw dogs as part of pets in the family. So the racial part of us, the cultural part of that was more of a shock to me. Every time I saw a horse, I would think of violence, I would think of riots coming up. So for me, I had to really tune myself, figure out exactly what kind of area I did. But the most thing the underlying part of my introduction, my visit was, I wanted to know exactly where my guests come from, both culturally, their beliefs, and what they look for. So from that, I learned a lot. And when it came to integration, I felt in the country we had what you call tribes, but in the US, I figured out they've got what you call the East Coast and the West Coast, the South and the North. So for me, all these were like, I was trying to define areas based on that. In Africa, I define people by their tribes. In the US, I started defining them as where they came from. Now, one of the biggest things that I found in the US that kind of took me aback, shock-wise in terms of culture, when I went to the South, I noticed there was a lot of eyes looking at me, because my host at that point was more of very talkative person. And every place I went, he introduced me, and everybody looked at me as if I've come from a different planet. And we started getting all these questions about, oh, do you guys have telephone? Can we call you back home? So some of those things kind of really got me wondering why I'm being asked questions that are a bit really off. So for me, culturally, and the shock that I learned from there, I figured out, as much as we want to believe everything is the same, there's a lot of changes. There are a lot of differences when you talk of Africa and the West. When you talk of the West, I talk about America and Europe, so to speak. So at the very first place, actually, I saw what I could call segregation big time. Well, I think it was in Alabama, because I went into an eatery place, and everybody turned and looked at me. And I think it became apparent when I started talking that I felt I was really out of place, not because of my color, but because of the accent. So sometimes I look at the cultural part of, the racial part of any place is not only the color, but how people talk, how they express, and how they fit in where they go to. But when you coming back now to Paul's issue about Floyd, I want to steal some of his part of his talk. For us as a country, we've always had what we call instant ramification as to whatever happens in the West. Being a major tourist destination that has a lot of flights that come in the country, something happens in Europe, US, or Asia, within 10 hours, the first flight that comes up with that information. And having been exposed to so much of the internet, we learned a lot of all this. And I remember people ask me, when you go to the US, do you feel like you're safe? Because what we see about this case about somebody being killed, how safe do you think you are? I'm like, and sometimes I would joke and tell them, I think where I come from, if you spend a bullet on me, you'll be wasting a bullet. I bet my life is not worth a bullet. I'll just make a joke of that, make them feel comfortable, and I'm okay with it. So from me, the whole Floyd thing opened up a new chapter in my mind, or a new approach to it. I'd seen so many of those racial strikes or protests, but this one particular one was a very different one. And I think I would sum it before I take too much of your time. The fact that it became so strong because it was during the COVID and everybody was at home. So people didn't have much to do. So they're all at home, didn't have anything to do. They didn't have any jobs to go to. So they had all this free time in their hands. They're not making money. And most of them needed money. So that's why they ended up looting. So all this was kind of like a spiral from the COVID that actually brought up this. I wouldn't call it idleness, but I would call that so much time on in their own hands. They didn't have money, so they had to go and loot, if I may say, to either feed themselves or take advantage of the protest. I think I'll stop for there for the time being, and if there's any questions that could come up, we'll address them as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Macau. Going to move on to April now, and we have a little bit of a shift in perspective here. We're really lucky to have April with us, who fits with the theme of the event that we're holding, because she is speaking to us from Senegal, but April grew up in the United States and recently moved to Senegal. April is really a leading thinker in the movement for racial justice. April is the principal of Joyous Justice Consulting, provides highly customized diversity consulting. She also serves as the racial justice director of the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable. She's the immediate past vice president of Audacious Hospitality for the Union for Reform Judaism. She's a graduate of Tufts University, a member of the Sela Leadership Network, and an alumna of the Jewish Community Organizing Jeremiah Fellowship and the Schusterman Insight Fellowship for Jewish Community in Washington, D.C. April is a past president of the Jewish Multiracial Network, conducted research at the Kennedy School of Government, and was an AmeriCorps Fellow for the Black Ministerial Alliance of Greater Boston. More recently, before joining the staff of the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable and the Union for Reform Judaism, April proudly served on the leadership team of the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable. April is currently, as I said, in Dakar, Senegal, and has definitely some interesting comparative experience between Africa and the United States when it comes to issues of race. April, we're really happy to have your perspective. Just remind you to unmute yourself before you speak.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm honored to be included in this conversation, and I join both joyfully and humbly. As Robin said, I'm approaching, I'm an American expat living in Dakar. I am taking it a day at a time. I do plan to be a resident of Senegal for the long term, but taking it a day at a time. And I think it might help to explain a little bit briefly about what brought me to Dakar and the African continent. And then I want to share some of my reflections around what's happening in the States as an American of African heritage living in Senegal. So one off the bat, I think I still haven't fully processed all of it. It's interesting, between COVID having us indoors, and when I first moved to Senegal, I'd been here 2 other times and I was fine, but when I moved here permanently, I had a period of getting sick a few times. So I've been mostly actually in the house, and easing my way into life here. One thing I'm also just going to name right now, I remember what I was going to say, is that, so I'm still, it's an interesting dynamic, and Robin and I have spoken about this in other contexts, because just to sort of situate myself in the conversation right now, in the United States. So I'm a mixed heritage person. I'm Jewish, and I have Native and European and African ancestry. And in the context of the United States, I have consistently classified as Black. I grew up living all around the United States. I was born in North Carolina, in the South. We were there for 6 months. I lived in South Dakota in the northern Midwest for 6 years. For 3 years, I lived in Blacksburg, Virginia, outside of Roanoke, outside of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And 4th grade through high school, I grew up in Northern California. And then I went to college in Boston. So I can do all kinds of accents from all over the country. I have a friend who likes to joke that I have a very white Southern accent because I live near white people in the South. So it's interesting in this conversation because in the context of growing up in the United States, where for much of US history, Black people were a minority in the country, in the context of the United States, people, when they have mixed heritage, are often classified almost exclusively as Black. And now it's interesting on the African continent, where not always, but often that is flipped, since the majority of folks are Black and African. And so the place that mixed heritage people play, I find, in societies often serves the power base. So in the United States, it makes sense to classify mixed heritage people as Black because they don't need the numbers. But in the context of Africa, at times, whether it's in South Africa or other parts of the continent, it makes sense to classify those people either as colored or as white. And I find, depending where I am in Senegal, that it varies, but I often am classified in a different way that for me is surreal, as someone who for most of my life has been classified and has been has experienced a lot of racism in the context of the United States, and is the daughter of a Black man who has endured a lot of trauma and pain at the hands of racism and people instituting racism. So that's a little bit about the frame that I'm bringing into this conversation. And I have a lot of expertise around race and ethnicity in the United States, and also have a fairly strong understanding of elements of colonialism in the broader world. But I don't think my knowledge is quite as deep as Paul and as Makau's. And so I want to speak with a bit of humility because I'm new in this context, and speak from my place of knowing, from my specific vantage point. So in terms of how I ended up in Senegal, I would have never guessed that I would be living on the African continent, despite throughout my life having a profound connection to Africa, since over half of my family are the descendants of people who were stolen from the African continent. I am someone who, in general, like my colleagues on this panel, who I grew up, I was very passionate about local issues. So I valued global concerns, but my concern has often been relative to the context I was in, the people who were unglamorous, who were being ignored. So it would bother me as a child when people would talk about international concerns when I saw poor people in our town. And obviously both of those things need concern, but I saw an avoidance at times. And to the point where in college, I ended up choosing to do AmeriCorps instead of traveling abroad. I had the good fortune of being able to travel abroad a little bit. In high school, I spent 2 weeks in Japan. But in college, I wanted to do work in poor Black communities and communities of color in the Boston area, and thought that I had the rest of my life and clearly to travel abroad. But it was more important to me that I represent the people who are forgotten in my backyard, in the context of being at a university where many people really prioritized international relations. And so it's pretty actually, so relative to all of that to say, it's very comical now that I have relocated to West Africa, but of all the people who might end up living abroad, it's kind of funny that I am that person. But 2 years ago, a friend invited me on what she informally called a Black, Jewish, African birthright trip to Senegal. So she's an African heritage Jew who wanted to invite other Black and African heritage Jews to return to Africa, to visit Africa. And she personally had connection to Senegal, and so that's the place where she chose. And there's a concept, I think some of the people on the call may be Jewish, but not everyone. There's a concept in Judaism called Aliyah, and it basically means returning home to a sacred homeland and a spiritual elevation. Am I coming through okay, Robin?
Yeah, much better.
Okay, great. And I normally find at times, I think, because everyone's home in Senegal, the bandwidth is strained, but I'll come back on video in a moment. It seems to calm down. It's like it has a little freak out and then it calms down. And so, and I have had the blessing of being able to travel to Israel and Palestine and found it meaningful. But when I visited Senegal, both in returning to the African continent for me has been one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. So I came here initially on vacation. I had no idea that I would be relocating here. And I did a lot of ancestral work before I came and while I was here, and had visions and just a very profound personal experience here that helped me shift my perspective around the work I wanted to be doing in the world, and made very clear for me how profound my longing to be connected to the African continent is. I'm living here in Senegal, but I would love to visit other countries as well. And I have this secret desire, as someone who doesn't know what her heritage is, to kind of just travel around and see if I can just feel when I get to the place where my ancestors are from, or if I'm eventually going to need to cave and do a DNA test. But I don't really trust those things. I don't want to give them my DNA. Because of racism and other things, I just don't really trust it. So, okay. So that's a little bit of background on me. I don't want to take too much time. Here's what I would share around my experiences of being in Dakar, Senegal, and being a member of a West African Muslim Senegalese family, in terms of my relationship with my partner and husband and his extended family. I'll just paint a few scenes for you. So we were watching the news a couple of weeks ago when the uprisings and protests were really beginning to pick up in the States, and the national news in Senegal covered the story. And for me, it was this profoundly awakening and healing experience to watch the news coverage from Africa, in that I needed it translated because they were speaking French. And to be honest, I feel like I already know 2 colonial languages. So I'm prioritizing learning the most popular indigenous language here, which is Wolof. So I don't really follow much French. And so so Hassan, my partner, kindly translates for me, and both in terms of what they were saying, and then they showed footage. And he was explaining to me that they were saying that there is this horrible issue of law enforcement in the United States murdering unarmed Black people. And then they showed what I think is a will.i.am music video with the young Black boy. Maybe some of you have seen it. I believe the former President Barack Obama posted the video of this young Black boy singing how he just wants to live. And they showed the full video that showed scenes of police brutality and the actual murder, pictures of the murder of George Floyd. And it was such a profoundly healing and meaningful experience for me to see that. Because in the United States, there's always this, what I now see very clearly, I was aware of before, but seeing it in a different context, it was so meaningful to me to see that a news channel anywhere, but in Africa, was covering what mattered most in the story. That innocent people were being harmed and hurt while they were exercising their right to protest, and that an unarmed man was killed, and that this was a tragedy. And that unlike in the United States, where they might talk about the looting or other dynamics at play, or fires, like Senegal didn't cover that at all. Like, they were crystal clear about what was most important in the story, which was the loss of sacred human life. And that has been so helpful for me to see. And then Hassan told me later on that the hosts were also talking about, like, maybe this will cause more Africans or African Americans to move back to Africa. We hope that they know that they're welcome here and that they will be safe here. So a couple other things I would say is that it's been very interesting to watch my partner become more political. Like, we've been able to understand each other more, because I think he saw me before as very political, but now that he understands the violence and the brutality that Black people face in America, he now understands why I am so passionate about standing up for African heritage people around the world in the context of colonialism in Africa or in the United States, in more explicit racism and dealing with the unresolved legacy of enslavement in the United States. And it's been, and so in some ways, the silver lining of this tragedy has been, it's been a meaningful coming together of Hassan's family and me, where we all seem to understand each other more. That I now understand that they're not as political in the way that I am, because they aren't under attack in the same way that my family is in the States, and they now understand my activism and my leadership and why I'm so passionate. And my partner now has, which he wouldn't have had before. He has a Black Lives Matter sign on one of his profiles, like on his WhatsApp profile. And his brother, I think for the first time in his life, his twin brother who lives in Harlem with his Senegalese wife went to a protest. And so the thing that I would notice that I'm observing both in my own family through marriage, as well as Senegalese news is covering, is that I'm also noticing around the globe. It's not just Americans who are noticing this, it's also the broader global community noticing this injustice. And I think the other thing that also felt healing for me to hear is that Hassan at one point told me that the newscasters in Senegal were saying that the law enforcement in the U.S. is lucky that Black people aren't fighting back, that they are literally almost acting out a low-grade war on Black people and regularly murdering them, because studies show that it's roughly around once a day or so in the country that an unarmed Black person is killed by a member of law enforcement or someone in a security role, and that is a major humanitarian crisis. So I think there's probably more I can say. I think the last piece that I will note on a personal level is that I'm in the midst of sort of a surreal experience where I'm in Dakar. But because all of my work is in the United States and I'm regularly following the news and it's viscerally in my bones, this lived experience of having lived in the States, I still very much feel and I'm in communication with them and serving as a resource to people who are on the ground. And the one key difference that I am noticing right during this moment where there is so much news coverage and there are many scenes is that before I was living in Senegal, I have a little bit less terror. Both my father and brother at different points in the younger parts of their lives were stopped at gunpoint by law enforcement. When I was a young girl, my father was beaten by the police when he was homesick from work one day from his job at Accenture Consulting. And so for me, the threat of violence or the possibility, it feels very real to me that somebody I love, and I'm sleep deprived because I've been working around the clock with this, so sorry. So that is still there for me, but I have a little bit less terror because I know right now I feel fully safe in my body in Senegal. Being on the African continent, I feel like for the first time in my life, I don't need to be afraid in the same way of law enforcement. And so that is a relief. But I still worry as an American about what it would be like to bring my Senegalese partner to the United States, particularly since he is very dark, he's very tall, and English is his third language. And I would worry that if police were violent, one, he hasn't been trained like my family has to be fearful and deferential to the police. He would talk to them like they're a normal person. Like he would talk to police in Senegal, and that could be a danger for him in the context of United States racism. And I also worry, because it's his third language, if there were ever a situation where law enforcement were violent with him, that words may fail him. And it's just scary no matter what. So, and it's time for me to stop. So I will stop there. We will switch to Q&A.
Well, thank you. Thanks, April. That's just so many varied experiences that you have had and that all three of you have had and shared. I'll invite everybody. Some of you have already started putting some really interesting questions into the Q&A panel. If anybody else has questions to add, go ahead and type them in. If you like the questions that you see there, instead of repeating something similar, go ahead and hit the thumbs up to upvote the question that you hope will be asked. There's a question that I see here near the top, which is a question about the encounters that the three of you yourselves personally have had with police. Have any of the three of you yourselves had interactions with American police? And if so, what were they like?
My encounter, I think I was traveling, I think I was in Texas. We were in a Greyhound, because one of the ways that I like sometimes traveling is travel as basic as one can be. So we were driving in Texas and we got stopped. And interesting enough, when the policeman came to the car and to the bus, I saw them like as if they were looking for a particular person. So they came and passed me and went behind. This Hispanic family with the kids and everything. And I don't know what happened. In the whole confusion, the Hispanic did not speak good English. And at that point, I think I spoke some Spanish. And I was called in to translate, which I found very interesting. Because I volunteered, nobody wanted to come to the help, but I could see how scared they are. Having been in such situations before, I felt it was at least fair if I could play that part. So I came in and I translated the questions from the police to the Mexicans. And interesting enough, they all focused to me as if I was a government employee trying to get answers from. And they were able to explain to the police officers that they were there legally, and they're just going to visit their family. So the policeman asked me, like, where are you from? And I think from my accent, it told them that I'm not from the US. And the first thing they told me, like, oh, you sound like someone from UK. And then I just laughed. Of course, having had an experience with the law in the US, I just told them, well, actually I'm from Kenya and was just out to visit. I think for me, the fact that language was a barrier brought up this issue of the racial and why they were profiled as if they were not supposed to be there. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad diffuse the tension between the police officers and Mexican family.
Thanks. April, would you like to add anything?
Sure. I had several different encounters when I was young. When I was young, my brother used to call the police and would hang up. Like, he was a kid, he had different behavioral differences, but I'll say, and so he would call the police and hang up. And we were in Blacksburg, Virginia, in the South, and eventually they called and asked my parents to bring him in. And overall, to make a long story short, it was a very sweet experience. They were very kind. They let him go into the police car and make the sirens go, and they gave him a little fake badge. And it was really sweet. And prior to my father being beaten by the police, we always used to wave at the police when we would see them on the road and say, oh, there's a police officer, wave. But then when my brother and I were playing one day when we came home, we learned that my father had been beaten by the police. We didn't see it, thank God, but my mother had. And so she had post-traumatic stress from that for a while, but we went with them to the hospital. We waited for our family friends to come from our synagogue, and they drove my brother and me, and my mom drove my father to the emergency room because he needed to be treated from the harm that had been done. And then following that, for a couple years, the police would occasionally randomly stop my mother around the city, basically low-key harassing her, and regularly stop her for no real reason, it seems, other than to scare her. So I always hold on to that sweet experience, and I know that in general it's not all police officers, that I think that there's some challenges fundamentally with the law enforcement system, but that first encounter we had was helpful. And then also I have a cousin who was in law enforcement for a number of years as a state police officer, and he's a beloved Black cousin of mine. So I've had a mixture of experiences, and for me, fortunately, not quite as harsh as the Black men in my family have had directly, but I have had a few different scary experiences or moments of aggression where I felt at times law enforcement officers, I don't think of time I'm going to go into the story, but there was another story with my family where we called law enforcement for help, and they were just incredibly aggressive with my family in a way that scared me. So those have been some of my experiences.
Thank you, April. I'd like to turn to another pair of questions from our audience. There's one question here for both Paul and Mikau, and I'll ask Paul to answer first. As an African visiting America, have you felt fear for your safety? And do you think it's similar to the fear that Black Americans feel? And there's a follow-on question about whether you think that Black Africans you know have a fear for their safety when considering coming to the US. So Paul, I'll ask you to answer that first. Oh, Paul might be frozen. I'm gonna ask Mikau to go first, and then we'll try again with Paul.
Have I ever felt unsafe? Actually, no. I've never felt unsafe. And if anything, sarcastically, most of my hosts actually, some of them have felt uncomfortable whenever I travel alone, when I'm their host, when I'm their guest. And a case in point was, I think I was in California. And apparently I'd heard that California was one of the most cosmopolitan states in the US, that everybody felt like they were part of California. And we had gone on this, you can't call it bash, but it was like a party of some kind. And that evening, I was actually taking a train to go north. And from where I was, because I was in Berkeley, I was supposed to actually take the train from Berkeley to Oregon. And I think the train was leaving around, if not 1, so just past midnight. So when my host had where I was taking the train from, he was so scared. I'm like, oh, no, you cannot do that. I'm like, why cannot I do that? I thought that's a good place. I mean, if Amtrak stops there, it should be a good place. Like, no. We don't go to that neighborhood. And for me, that kind of got me confused, because this is the US, this is a train station. Apparently it stops there. Why would my friend not allow me to go there? So he didn't explain to me, and I figured out later on that he was trying to cover up the fact that sometimes they also have dark sides in the US. And it took him, I think he drove me for about an hour north from Berkeley so that I could go and connect it. And from that point, it became apparent that every single time I travel, I have to check with my friends. I also have to check with whatever time I travel. When you ask about if people who come from Kenya, they feel uncomfortable with the US, there's so many people who come to the US, or rather who love come to the US. The very first time I came to the US, everybody was so happy for me, because they figured that my problems are now over. Because to the America is like your ticket out of poverty. So when a week before I left, they would all come to my house like, oh, I'll get the TV, I'll get the radio. I'm like, yeah, the radio. Like, oh, we thought you're not coming back. I'm like, no, I'll come back. Like, no, you're just trying to be difficult. Cut the story short, I went to the US, was there for about 3 months. I think I was about 30 or so years. I was there for 3 months. And when I came back, everybody thought that I was crazy. Like, how would I go, stay for 3 months and then come back? Because everybody feels like when they go to the US, it's now an opening to a better life. People actually auction their properties, sell properties to come to the US. But most of them actually very hard, and because they've actually painted a very good picture of themselves in the US, most of them end up actually doing illegal stuff so they can stay in the US and avoid coming back home. So you still have this two stereotype that going to the US is a ticket to prosperity, which is again true, but also you have to really get out of your comfort zone to make it better for yourself.
Thanks. Paul, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, just like John said, my first time of coming there, like everybody is happy for you, and everybody is looking for the day you're coming back because they're expecting lots of things. You have a list of things to bring back home from the US. So it's more of a success story when you go to the US. And when you're coming back, there are lots of expectations. Yeah. that's what I can add on. He has basically said everything like what I could say. My first time and when I come, what people expect. And that's it.
Okay, thank you. I want to pause here. We're just over the time that we had allotted for this conversation, and I'm extremely grateful for all three of our speakers for giving us their time, for opening up their hearts and their minds to all of us, and also grateful for all of our participants for sharing all of your time with us. I think this is a really interesting conversation. It's a really different type of conversation than most of what's happening right now in the US. But I think also really important to think in different ways about questions of what it means to bring together people who are different, and to think about the ways that people who are different coexist in our world, on our planet, in one community. So with that, I will say goodbye to all of you. And if you have more questions or you want to follow up on anything from this call, feel free to reach out to me for ways to connect with our panelists. Thanks to everyone.